Hello, everyone. I'm Stu, and I'm your host, and I'm here with Patty, author, paranormal investigator, and the paranormalist. Patty, how are you tonight?
I'm doing really well. I've had a great day, and I am raring to go to talk about our episode tonight, which is Men in Black.
That's going to be an interesting subject.
It is a fascinating subject. You don't see much about it right now currently. It was popular late 90s, early 2000s, and then after the movies and all that stuff died down, it just sort of fell through the cracks. But beyond all of the hype and the Hollywood, there's this undercurrent of real stories that have never really gone away.
All
You
right.
know, and I think that the first thing we need to talk about is who are the Men in Black, or what are they, and some of the different theories that are out there. So the first one is that a cultural myth or an urban legend. So there's a writer by the name of John Sherwood who claimed his friend Gray Barker, and anybody who's heavily into the UFO community will recognize that name. He was quite famous early on in the paranormal world for UFOs. Anyhow, that Gray Barker had concocted the myth of the Men in Black in a book he wrote in 1956, and the book was called "They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers." And Sherwood always said that Gray came up with this kind of as a joke, kind of like the stories of L. Ron Hubbard and how he had made a bet with another science fiction writer that he could
Great.
create a religion and all that. And then, of course, we know what happened. Scientology was born. But anyhow, so the thought is that that might have been one of the ways that it happened. But I don't know that that's actually true. So the next one is that they're government secret agents, Cold War sort of thing. So in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the CIA and our United States government was embarking on a Cold War. With the end of World War II had happened. They Project Paperclip brought in approximately 1,700 German scientists. They were talking about going to the moon, all of this stuff. And our government was in this race, a race that I think actually violated human rights and ethics and a whole lot of other things. But that these might be secret government agents who are going in to clean up the mess or to scare people into keeping their mouths shut. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff that does go along with most Men in Black stories. I have never seen a Men in Black story that said, well, hey, these two dudes came to visit me and we had a cup of tea and chatted a little while, and they said, hey, that UFO you saw, it wasn't really there, you must have mistaken a satellite or something. That's not what happens. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So that's a theory that people have always proposed. And maybe a few of them are, but I don't think that's the bulk of the stories. That these are aliens or alien-produced androids. You hear, especially in the early, I'd say up through 2000, and every so often still, you hear stories where people will talk about these beings coming in and they're like caricatures of people. So in 1999, say, there's a story that about a person who was visited by two men in black and a woman in black, because they're not always men. Sometimes there are a woman in black as well.
Oh.
They're not as well known, but they do exist. And the lipstick was wild on their faces. Like all three of them had lipstick on, and it kind of went out over the seams of the lips as though it was badly applied. The skin was paper white. They were dressed like somebody from the 1940s with fedoras, and they spoke in a robotic manner. So the idea is that maybe there are androids or aliens trying to pretend to be human so that they can be intimidating and pass through this world more or less unseen. And interestingly enough, these creatures, whatever they are, tend to like to drive really old 1960s cars. Cars with the big fins and the fishtails and all that stuff. They drive those big Chryslers and stuff. They don't drive normal modern little cars. So it's interesting about that as well. The fourth theory, which is beginning to gain more traction, is that they're demons.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was like never really talked about in the UFO community. UFO community and the Bigfoot community have some parallels, and both communities want desperately to be taken seriously. So they're talking about, creatures from other planets that have come here to investigate or to run tests on us, much like we do testing on animals in the wild. And people seem to be able to relate to that. But if you start bringing up certain subjects like perhaps these entities are demonic, or maybe there's a connection between UFOs and Bigfoot, you're very quickly shut down. In the Bigfoot community, you have the same issue, where if you go outside that normal standard Bigfoot definition for any reason, you're shut down. So the idea of demons has been very much frowned upon by the powers that be in the UFO community. However, there are a few people, a couple who are fairly prominent, who have come around to that way of thinking, and a few others who are willing to entertain the possibility.
Okay.
And John Ventry, who was on Hangar 1, has publicly stated that he has changed his mind. He was very much against the concept of demons. And then he had something happen in his own life which convinced him otherwise. And his story is really interesting. I'm hoping that sometime John will come on and tell his story himself. And so I'm not going to go into detail on it because I'm hoping that John will do that. There's other things that make me think there might be something to this theory. For example, there's a very famous UFO sighting in Pascagoula from the 1970s where two men, an older gentleman and a young gentleman, were fishing after work one night on the pier, and they were taken into a UFO. And under hypnosis, the younger of the two men, years later, was asked to go into his memories because he couldn't remember much about it. He was terrified, and it's a fascinating story. And when we go to UFOs, I'd like to talk about it more. But during the recovered memories component, which was done with a world-renowned psychiatrist, man came up with information that took him down a very dark tunnel. In fact, it was so dark that he wrote a book about what he remembers, and he says first thing in the book, I've not yet listened to all of the tapes. I'm afraid. I don't want to. But this is the part I was able to hear before I had to turn them off. And then he starts talking about it. It's fascinating. I have a copy of this book. It's fascinating. So each and every one of those things are viable possibilities for what's going on. So keep that in mind as you're going through. And another thing I'd like to add as we start through this process is we as human beings tend to like to have everything black and white. So we want either or kind of situations. It's either aliens from outer space or they aren't there. That's not realistic. There's sometimes multiple things that can be going on all at the same time. And Men in Black, I see no reason why they can't be in that same category, where maybe some of them are CIA agents or secret government agents. Maybe some of them are from outer space or androids that have been, programmed to intimidate humans to keep some information from the public, although that's not working so well these days since the government announced all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them might be hoaxes. There's a lot of different things that could all be going on at the same time. So when we're factoring through all the stories here, I think we should remember all of that. So I told you that the first person supposedly who ever had talked about Men in Black was Gray Barker in the 1956 book. And that's interesting, and he did indeed do that. But there was a guy by the name of Howard Dahl who in 1947 actually gave the very first description of a mysterious man in black who warned him not to talk after he had a UFO encounter.
Did he happen to live around Roswell?
He did not,
Oh, okay.
but he had an encounter. He was very rattled. Time frame 1947. This would be something that wasn't even really something our minds could accept at that point. People weren't talking about it. Remember, Kenneth Arnold had only just had his sighting, so this stuff is all still very much new. There's not a whole lot out there. The media was a totally different animal than it is today. There were 3 channels and a few newspapers and magazines, and then a couple things like Fate magazine, which was always a place where you could go to read about the bizarre. And so Howard Dahl didn't have a whole lot of places he could have learned about the ideas of all of this. And the Men in Black, to the best of anybody's ability to tell, had never appeared before. So when he started talking about these black-clad strangers who warned him not to talk about his UFO encounter, that's compelling because there's no precedent for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was, the one of the first things that I found interesting. So one of the best cases of Men in Black stories, and one of the most disconcerting, is that of Dr. Hopkins, who was a consultant on UFOs in a case in Maine. And one evening he is working on this case. He gets a phone call, and the person says he's an activist in the UFO community and he would like to speak to Dr. Hopkins. So he makes arrangements, says, hey, I'm really close by. Can I just stop over? And within minutes, this guy's at the door. When Hopkins opens the door, the man is standing there. He's wearing a black suit, a black tie. He has those unusual features, almost like he's a mannequin. He's very stony looking, and he has no eyebrows. He's got no hair, very pale complected. He was put together, but not as though somebody actually knew what a human face should look like. So they just did their best guess. You know what I'm saying?
I do. Yeah. And what you're describing, if you've ever watched the TV show Fringe, they had similar Men in Black in that particular show, sci-fi show.
But yeah, I've never seen it. But this was very common, particularly early on. Almost like they got the idea of the 2 eyes, the nose, the mouth, basic general shape, but they missed like the eyebrows and stuff like that. So this guy comes and he's got no hair, no eyebrows. He's very pale. As soon as Hopkins opens the door, his dog begins barking erratically and just acting in a very bizarre, terrified manner. And the dog has to be removed from the room. So the visitor asks him a bunch of questions about the case he's on, and he answers the questions. He's beginning to feel very uncomfortable about the whole thing, and his inner voice is saying this is a bad situation. The man says to Hopkins, there's 2 coins in your pocket. Why don't you remove one of them? Now, how he would know that, Hopkins didn't know, but indeed he stuck his hand in his pocket, and sure enough, there were just 2 coins in his pocket. So he pulls out the coin. It's a penny. It's very new and shiny and recently minted. And the guy says to him, watch the coin closely. And he does. And as he does, the appearance of the coin begins to shift and shimmer and almost become ghostly, like it's fading in and out. And eventually the coin just disappears right there, even though he's still holding his hand together as though he's holding the coin, but the coin's just now gone. Mm-hmm. And then the man in black looks at Hopkins and says, the coin will never be seen on this plane again. And if you continue to inquire about this case, the same will happen to you. Now, you can't get much more terrifying and blunt.
No, and extraordinarily intimidating, and you mentioned before about the news media at that time not being what it was today. And I think even in the 40s and 50s, people had a great deal of national pride and patriotism. So if they were told this would probably not be good for the country if this information came out, or as a good patriot, you should probably not pursue this line of news. I think newscasters at that time would at least have um, they would probably want to do that. Just a guess, but I mean, I didn't grow up in the 50s, obviously, but I've seen things from then. So it just seems strange, though, that they have to be so intimidating, and the stories are very intimidating. And
yeah, they're almost to a T intimidation all the way. And actually, Hopkins was so upset by what happened, and the case he was looking into, by the way, was Barney Hill, as in Betty and Barney
Barney
Hill.
and Betty Hill, yep.
Yeah.
Interrupted Journey, yep.
Yes. So after that, this man left him, Hopkins took everything he had on the case and destroyed it. After that, he would report that he had trouble with his telephones. The telephone company said his line was being tampered with or tapped, but they couldn't figure out what was going on and had to redo the lines. And he just had a lot of other problems with almost like he's being spied upon, even though he had destroyed everything. It was almost like whatever this was just making sure. He didn't reach out by phone and say anything to Barney Hill or to anybody else about it. And I just thought that was a fascinating story because it's such an early story, and he actually he actually gave up his research. And he's not the only one. There's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Bender, who has been a researcher in the field since the 1950s. And Bender claims that at one point he was doing a lot of writing and publishing about the subject in a magazine called Space Review. And then one night he was visited by 3 men in black. They were all identically dressed. They visited him in his home, and they warned him that if he continued to talk about this topic of UFOs, that something would happen to him. He would never tell anybody exactly what they said, but he was definitely a changed man, very terrified. He immediately shut down his research, and he shut down a center he had just opened called the Flying Saucer Bureau. People who knew him said after this he was a totally different person. He would write a little bit, but it would be rambling, almost unintelligible. He was in constant anxiety and fear, what they call hypervigilance. He claimed that he would receive strange phone calls and there would never be anybody on the other end. And this continued, just so you know, from the 50s until 2002 when he died.
I guess that shows you he was onto something.
I do believe he might have been.
Yeah, why would you target somebody who was, pursuing something that was a hoax or, something other than what it appeared to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and to think that, a person who was spending all this time of his life working on all of this, and whatever was said or done to him or in front of him was so significant, he changed his entire life in that day. So that's 2 doctors who have done this, who were intimidated into complete and total silence. And, not just that. Now, I said about the story of Harold Gull. Let's talk about it. So he lived in a place called Murray Island, and he would salvage logs with his son from their fishing boat. And one day he's out there with his son, and they see these 6 what he called donut-shaped craft flying above them, and they would drop what looked like his description was molten waste or molten something material into the lake. And apparently whatever they were dripping off of them was literally hit him and his boat. He said his dog was killed by it and his son was injured by it. and they got off the lake and they were really shaken, and they didn't know what to do, who to talk to. This was something that was not talked about. Nobody had the faintest clue what was going on. This is 1947, for heaven's sake.
Mm-hmm.
So he's afraid to say anything to anybody. So he goes to work, and there's a couple friends there at work and a boss that he's spoken to a couple times about this. Now, he didn't say this was flying saucers or anything like that. He said, I saw these things, I don't know what they were, and talked about whatever this was dripping down off of them. And one day he comes to work, and there's a man standing there at his job, and the guy's dressed all in black, and he says to him that he urges him not to talk about the encounter he had. And he's like, okay, fine. He says later that he felt very intimidated by this man. The man didn't say specifically anything that was intimidating, but just the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, was intimidating.
Well, I think just the fact that somebody knew that he had an encounter of if he really only told his one work associate, unless that person told other people and it went up a chain somewhere, unless there was some type of government agency, watch group, or even some type of communication between whoever would have been piloting these craft, for example, with the government.
Exactly.
That's how the word got back. So I mean, that again points to some type of collusion with our government.
And indeed, that's really cool that you said that, because the next thing that happens to him is that he goes to work a couple weeks later, and there are several Air Force agents. That's how they defined themselves. Hello, we're from the Air Force. And it said that they were on a mission to gather information about what he had seen. Now, Gull's story is now picking up steam. So some of the local police are trying to figure out what's going on. People are hearing about it because it's, these things are happening at his work. And so people are going home and saying, there's these FBI guys, or these, Air Force guys that were here and today, and they were talking to him. I wonder if it's about that crazy thing he saw up in the sky a few weeks ago. Kind of a deal. Well, it gets to the point where this sounds insane, but the FBI begins to research this, and they wrote a report that was a filed report. And I actually have a copy of it. Now, so there's parts of it that are redacted, so it's difficult to read the whole thing. But they actually wrote a report and placed it in the record. The following is in general are the facts regarding the story as that started by, and then they have that redacted, which subsequently resulted in news stories, and they name all the different newspapers. That a B-52 carrying Army intelligence officers was shot down or sabotaged over Kelso, Washington on August the 1st, 1947, because it was carrying some flying disc fragments. So what did he see? Did he see other UFOs trying to get the plane down so that they could get back what was theirs?
Recover the materials, the metals, whatever.
Yeah. And like I said, there's you can read the entire thing. It's a couple pages long, but it exists, and you can do freedom of information and still get it. It's on the internet, by the way. You can also get it that way for free if you just start poking in the right places. But it's fascinating. So after the Man in Black came, and after the UFO guy and the Air Force guys came, and the Man in Black comes back, takes a second shot at him, then after the guy leaves that time, Gull will suddenly say the whole thing is a hoax, and that he told the story just for attention. Now, years and years will go by, and later he will say that he made that comment under duress, that he's afraid to talk about anything more other than to say, I didn't lie the first time.
Again, we talked, in the last episode, how just the truth, when it gets squashed like that, that does make me angry, that, I mean, I guess you would expect that from a socialist government, or you would expect that from communist government, but certainly not here in the United States. Now, I'm sure these kind of things happen worldwide,
Sure.
but it really depends, I guess, on the government. But it doesn't sound like the government's following the Constitution, at least whenever they're employing tactics like this. And unless also we discussed off camera last time
Mhm.
how that, and I had the idea that, well, what would happen if you knew something that, if the information got out, would change society or change humanity, to such a degree that it would really be better off if people didn't have that information. Now, I'm not saying that that's what happened here,
Right.
but if, to use this type of intimidation to just stop people from talking, yeah, I don't think that would be, I don't think that would fall under the category of protecting disinformation.
Yeah, and I think that I think there's a couple things that go on. First of all, the argument for us not knowing has always been based upon War of the Worlds. So the H.G. Wells radio play. So that was always trudged out as, well, what happened when War of the Worlds was run. People got shot and they shut down their homes and they fled and it was mass hysteria. Birds and cats were talking to each other and dogs were dancing in the fields. My God, we can't have this crap. And that's been a very often trotted out excuse for why the government can't tell us things,
Mm-hmm.
because we can't handle it. But
Well,
as
look what people do whenever the result of a court case isn't what they wanted it. And I'm not going to say either way, but look what happens. Riots, destruction, injury. This is, yeah, it's an interesting time we live in. So the entire Men in Black, and I'm going to go back to a 1960s British movie called The Monitors.
okay.
And if you've never seen that, I urge you to look it up. It may be completely out of print, but it essentially was an alien race who came, and of course this is in 60s London, and there's these aliens dressed in black suits, black bowler hats, carrying black umbrellas, and they're almost like, they're like hall monitors, except for the city. They keep people from doing bad things against one another. And eventually the people rebelled against the monitors and got them off the planet. But it was just, the description being Men in Black, well, that's
Right.
really similar to what the monitors were. And they didn't use intimidation, though. They just basically were like, don't do that.
Wow.
People didn't. So, yeah. But so I'm wondering if the events of the 40s that you mentioned set in motion, and of course, the movies Men in Black, obviously, Hollywood is always looking for, Hollywood or Pinewood Studios, depending on what country you're in, are always looking for things to make movies out of. So there's probably a lot of truth in the fiction.
I think that's really how a lot of things are introduced to us. That we don't realize that there's actually a propaganda arm of the motion picture industry, but there is. And they've actually come out in recent years and said, yeah, we craft our movies to carry a certain agenda forward. So and I'm not speaking ill or well of or anything, but say when they wanted to push gay rights, so they would propagandize by making sure there had to be a gay character in this movie. There had to be, and they had to be the heroine or the hero, and yada yada, and it was sometimes more basic than that. It was, hey, Wise potato chips. You see them on there because they paid a great big amount of money
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that the hero is sitting there munching on Wise potato chips. But they did socially engineer their movies, and they do it to this day. And it's not a secret anymore. It's you can go and find information on it if you want to. There's an entire organization that all they do is lobby to socially engineer movies to have a certain narrative to allow only certain groups of people to participate. And this has been going on for a long, long time. It's just recently come out that this is actually not just an isolated person who has an agenda. This is an entire group of people who've created an organization that has an agenda. So, I mean, I have to tell you, I doubt everything. That's just who I am, mostly because I've read enough about things to know that I don't trust anybody. And seriously, I don't. I mean, I could take you back to the 1700s and tell you, you know, when the British government was sending people here. Now, I won't say William Penn did this, because the writings I've read of Penn and of Comrade Weiser, who was his representative here, were actually representative of the viewpoints that we know Penn to have had, which is that he would purchase the land, he would go and talk to the people. Comrade Weiser mostly did it for him, and negotiate with them. And the people, they had a say in what was going on. And he tried to build a bridge between him and the native people through Conrad Weiser, who's a phenomenal read if you ever get to learn anything about him. But the British government itself set up a system. What they did is they came here, they said, hey, you know, this land has been negotiated for, you can go settle there. And they didn't negotiate for it. Or they negotiated in poor faith with somebody who didn't own it. So it'd be kind of like somebody coming to me and saying, hey, so can we have Stu's house? And I'm like, well, yeah, it's not my house, you know? And then somebody knocks at your door and says, points a gun at you and says, you need to leave now. Patty said I can have your house. And you're like, she has a right to negotiate for my house. Mm-hmm. And that's basically what the British government did. But they had a plan in place, which you can go back and actually see, which was, yes, we're going to lie to these white settlers that are coming here. We're going to use them to clean out the Native American people. And then because the Native Americans are angry, they're going to kill these white people. But we now have the land improved on because they've built settlements and they've cleared land. Now we can go in and take it back. And if you want to think about it a little further, go and check out what the United States did in the West with the Native Americans. Same game plan. So they would tell the white settlers, best known story of that being Laura Ingalls Wilder's father, Charles Wilder, who was caught up in that whole thing where he went into a settlement area, they were told where they could settle. And then the Indians uprose because they didn't negotiate for whites to settle in that area. And they burned them out.
Oh.
And
my wife would know about that. She read the entire series.
I read it every year. It's a phenomenal series. Not nearly as syrupy sweet as the TV shows. It's much more realistic. But, you know, in reality, that's really what happened. The government came in, they put up these what they call bills, which were like advertisements saying, hey, we need people to go settle in Kansas. So Charles Wilder thought Charles Ingalls thought he would do the same thing. He would go settle in Kansas. So they found a place, they homesteaded it, they're proving it out, and then the Indians come and burn them out. And then this government guy rides in from the military and says, well, hey, you know, to appease the Indians, we're going to have to move you guys out of here. So you got to go. So 2 years of their lives, their building of their home, their hard work, their crops, everything's taken from them. And then the Indians have to leave. The whites that settled it have to leave. And guess who gets it? The government. It's now approved land. They've got housing on it. They've got cleared land. They've got fields that are plowable. And now they can sell it for a better price to the next guy.
Criminal.
Absolutely. You know, so I tend to question everything. And I think people, because I've seen so much and I've read so much, and I don't trust our government, not as far as I can throw it. I may trust the guy that like lives down the street from me, who's my town mayor or on my town council, because I know him. But government as a large entity has a totally different set of loyalties. And we're just now beginning to see that as a public. I think that's what red pilling's really about, is seeing that you have to think for yourself. You can't just trust that it's all going to go right. That's where all these conspiracies have come in. That's where these questions have all come from. But you know, so when I come into these stories about UFOs and aliens and and government agents, I'm not nearly as hard to convince as some other people, because I've heard these stories over and over, and there's a whole theme going on here, and it's a dark one. So I'd like to tell another story. This is really kind of an interesting one. I thought there's a couple that I thought are really super interesting. I wanted to share today. There's this dude named Paul Miller. He comes home from a hunting trip, gets out of his truck, and as he gets out and he's grabbing his gun and getting his, his stuff, his supplies from the day and everything, he looks out and he sees this luminous disc in the sky, and it lands in an empty field not far from him. And these two humanoid creatures emerge from this craft. They just come out. He's terrified. What the heck? He's got a gun in his hand and he shoots at them. He thinks he hits one of them, jumps in his car, and he takes off at a breakneck speed down the highway. He loses time at that point. So he's not sure what he was planning to do, whether it was to go find the police or go for help or what. The next thing he remembers, it's 3 hours later, and he's back at the house. So he's very unnerved about it, hasn't said anything to anybody. He decides he's just not going to talk about it. Just not worth rattling cages. Because he's not really sure what happened either. Other than he remembers the disc. He remembers everything clearly up until he was in the car, going down the highway. And then at that point, everything's just gone until he's back at the house. So the next morning he gets up and he goes to work. And he's an Air Force officer. He goes to work, and as soon as he gets into work, there's these three men in black suits standing there at his station, waiting for him. And they say to him, "We have your file." And he says, "I don't know what you're talking about." He's told nobody, not a single soul. His wife wasn't home. He told nobody what happened. And they said, "Look, we know all about it." And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And they're like, "Good. It's probably best you forget." And they started rattling off information about him, his name, where he worked, his family, his friends, where his family lived. I mean, they knew everything. And then again, they reinforced it with, it would probably be best if you just forget about this conversation as well. And they asked him a lot of very specific questions, and he kept saying, "I don't know, I don't know." And they would say, "Oh, well, this is the answer." So either they knew the answers, they wanted to feed him the answers they wanted him to have, one of the two. Miller would keep this quiet for years. He would wait till he was an old man to come forward and talk about it. And he did so because he felt that he was in a position now where the people he loved had mostly moved on or passed away. And he was old enough that now it didn't matter anymore. And he wanted to confirm other people's stories and say, "Look, I know they're telling the truth because this happened to me."
I find it interesting that his first response would be to take a shot at them.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, think about it. He's standing out there in the middle of nowhere. He lived in the country. This thing lands in a field, and these two humanoid-like figures come rushing out at him, and he's scared to death. He has a gun in his hand already because he just grabbed it out of the truck.
Well, I guess if they were rushing at him in a threatening manner, then yeah, that would be a self-defense mechanism. But
yeah, they were running through the field in his direction is what it was going on. And I think at that point, your fear, because, it's a UFO. So, like, nothing good's going to happen, And
yeah, I like to think the rational person in me, the first thing I would say is, wow, here's somebody, or I'm going to use the term somebody, that's well more advanced than we are. Yet look at this little pittance that I'm holding in my hands. What is this going to do? And if they're going to come running at me, I'm not going to be able to run away. So I think I would actually face it and just, see if I could find out what's going on. That may be the last thing I ever did on this planet, but that just seems to be the more rational thing to do. But I guess that the situation would dictate whether you're rational or not. Yeah.
And I think the fact that it was, well, first of all, he's military personnel, so I'm sure he was trained that in a bad situation you can defend yourself. But honestly, I would have run like hell, because that would have been horribly terrifying, to be out in the middle of nowhere by yourself with this huge luminous disc and these creatures coming out of it at you. And that would have just been hurt. I don't even know that your mind could comprehend it exactly, particularly in that time frame, because this was not recent. And he did what he thought he had to do. But you can still find his story, interviews and things that he gave at the end of his life when he was an older man. And you can tell, I mean, I've done this a long time, and I do therapy, counseling, and I listen to people all day long, and there's people that are shining you on and it. And then there's other people that are just so sincere that in that moment, they're telling the truth. And even then, again, a part of who I am, and I have to have that mindset for doing my job, is somebody will tell me something, but I know that may not be the whole story. That's their story, but that doesn't mean it's the whole story. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
So maybe they think they were
their
abused.
interpretation. Yeah.
Like I had a kid one time who told me that his dad tried to drown him in a creek. But when I talked to everybody else in the family, they're like, that's absolutely not what happened. What really happened was he and his dad were arguing. The kid was like 8 years old, and he was on one of those floaty rafts. And his dad said to him, don't float out in the middle of the creek. It's too deep. You don't know how to swim. And the kid was being a kid and being obnoxious. And he was like carrying on and not laying still on the floaty raft. And he floated it out into the middle where it was really deep. And he flipped it. And his dad kind of rushed over and grabbed him from under the water and drug him up by the hair of his head, because that's all he could get a hold of. And to this day, this kid's a man now. He believes his father tried to drown him. But every other person who was there told a totally different story.
I can believe that. When I was 8 years old, I was fishing with my father, and I was standing on actually my father and my brother was standing at as close to the water as I could get, because for some reason that would catch me more fish. So I'm standing as close as I can. Well, unbeknownst to me, the current had come and undercut the bank, and my weight caused it to collapse. And somehow, and also at 8 years old, I couldn't swim. And I remember somehow getting turned around, and I was clawing at the bank and thinking like, oh my goodness, I'm going to get swept away, because the current was pretty swift. And I remember looking at my father, and it seemed like he just kind of looked at me and was like, that's an interesting thing to be happening to my son. It's like he didn't rush right over and pull me out of the water. And eventually I scrabbled up and was able to pull myself out. And that was my interpretation of that event. But my father and my brother said, well, no, Dad came over and pulled you out. And I don't remember that at all. All I remember was me just frantically scrabbling at this, the crumbling bank, trying to get back up.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, when I sound skeptical about stuff and I'm always questioning everything, I first of all think that we all should have a healthy level of skepticism about things in our lives. I just do. And the other thing you have to remember is that it's really difficult to get absolute truth. It's one of the things I value the most in my life is absolute truth, and it's very hard to come by because our perceptions are off. People have agendas, things like that go on. And so people can tell you the most amazing story, but if they have a rationale for why that needs to happen, and they'll do it. And people can actually convince themselves of things that didn't happen. I had a case one time where the person had been told about an event that occurred when they were an infant, and they remembered it, but they didn't remember it. It was just that they had heard the story so many times, they had convinced themselves they remembered it. But a 2-month-old does not remember and cannot give you the details. They knew the intimate details of this story. which was because a family member kept bringing it up and dragging it through over and over and over again. And so whenever you talk to this person, they were traumatized, literally, by an event that they were unable to remember, but they thought they remembered because this family member would continually drill it into them that this is what happened. That's why false memories are things that we watch out for. That's why it's vital to see how a person does interviewing whenever you're interviewing in a police situation or a medical situation. There's so many things that can happen. They seem real and you think they're real, but they're not real.
You need that third person perspective to determine what happened.
Yeah, and you need to understand that we can supplement for things. So like that kid, because his dad and he were fighting at the time it happened, and his dad was being, he thought, a bully, because he was like, "Don't take that wrap out there. You're going to fool around, screw around with it, and flip it." And then minutes later, he screwed around and flipped it. And sure enough, he went under, and he saw it as his dad drowning him. And his dad pulled me up by my hair of my head, he said. And his mother, who was there, she's like, "Yes, he did," because that's all he could get a hold of. He was frantically feeling in the water trying to find him, and when he got him, he got a whole handful of hair, and he just pulled him up and saved him from drowning.
Yeah, it's not, at that point you don't go, "Oh, this is not a great purchase, so I'll just let him go and find something else." I'll try for an arm.
Yeah. You just grab what you got and go for it, man. But this kid was completely convinced his father tried to drown him. So I think that it's important, whatever subject we talk about, and I do spend a lot of time on things like, MK Ultra and CIA secret projects. In fact, there's one I would like to talk about some at a different episode that was phenomenal, that they just are putting the pieces together to now, about something that occurred during the MK Ultra stuff. And I'll share that with everybody in another episode, because I have 270 pages of notes on this already.
It sounds like we're going to have a lot of episodes.
So I'm hoping. I mean, I will tell you, before I do an episode, I probably have at least 100 to 150, maybe 200 pages per episode of backup notes, because I really go through it. I look at it from a lot of different angles. I read it from multiple sources, looking for where the primary sources came from, checking the primary source, finding out it's not a primary source, it's just the most often quoted source, and then finding out where they got it from. And it's a lot more complicated than it sounds. I probably put about 15 to 20 hours in for each episode.
And I thought video editing was difficult.
Well, if you're
that sounds like a cakewalk compared to what you're doing.
I love research, so to me it's treasure hunting. Okay, so I like it. And but if you don't have the facts, you shouldn't tell the story. So if I make mistakes, and I will, I'm human, I assure you it's not for lack of trying to not make mistakes. Because I'm doing my best. But I've pulled multiple sources for every story. I want to see that it's not going to go back to, if it's the person's actual individual interview, stuff like that, that's primary source material. But if it's just a blurb somewhere and then a writer takes it and runs with it, and I'm very well aware of the fact that happens. I've had, I don't know how many people contact me through the years and say, "Oh, I saw this great interview you did with so-and-so." And I'm like, "I never talked to that paper." And they're like, "No, yeah, wait, I'll send it to you." And, and I'll read it, and I'll see the bits and the pieces of like different interviews that has been done with me through the years. And they just sort of pulled from all these different interviews and pretended that we talked.
No fair.
And I've seen it multiple times. And I don't care. It doesn't bug me. They say nice things, and I don't care. But it's just, I know this kind of stuff happens, so I'm trying my best to avoid it. So our next story, to get back to our Men in Black, is there was this guy named Danny Gordon. He was a radio personality, and he lived in a place called Wythe County. I might be saying that wrong, but I think it's Wythe, Wythe. And they were experiencing, this would have been like the late 1980s, early 1990s, they were experiencing a flap of UFO activity. So this was like multiple sightings, multiple times by multiple people, which are, I think, interesting in and of itself. And
Validation. Yeah.
it's a huge amount of validation. So people would see them in the sky, and there would be dozens of people. Like there's one particular event that occurred where Danny Gordon, who had been hearing about it because he's a radio personality, and people would call in and talk about, hey, me and a group of buddies were hanging out the other night and we saw this, or we were downtown having supper at such and such a restaurant, came out and there were these lights zipping through the sky. So one night, Danny Gordon and his family are at the mall, the local mall, and they come out of the mall, him and his wife, and there's this huge group of people, other folks who had come to the mall, standing out there looking at the sky, and he looks up, and sure enough, there's a group of these lights zipping along and then pausing, stopping, jumping up and going different side directions, and stuff that an airplane shouldn't do. And doing it at speeds that he can't calculate as being rational. And he begins to take pictures. And he starts, checking out to see who all saw this. There's an entire school bus of students. He took a lot of photographs that night, and some of them at a very close range. He was totally convinced that whatever he was seeing was not something that was of this world. Mm-hmm. And this really rattled him. So he began trying to piece it together, do interviews with other witnesses. He had those photographs that he had blown up, and he had, just looked at them from every angle, was talking about it a little bit on his radio show. And then one day he received a phone call from a man who said he was ex-military. And he said, hey, look, you need to stop. Just stop. Because I'm going to tell you right now, this is going to cost you everything you have. You got to just put this away and let it go, because it's going to hurt your family, man. And this guy sounded sincere. It wasn't the Men in Black threat. This was somebody who sounded like this was the voice of reason, who knew what he was talking about, saying, don't keep this up. They're going to notice you. And they won't necessarily just come for you. They'll come for your family. But you got to stop. And he didn't, unfortunately for him. So one night he's at his house when he gets a phone call from a magazine. These two men, they say they work for this magazine, and they would like to come over and interview him about the UFOs that he sighted and everything. And he said, sure, come on over. So they show up, and it's bizarre. In some of the accounts, they say that there were two men and a woman. Some of the accounts say there was one man and a woman. So I'm going to say that there's a little bit of confusion on that. But he describes them as almost like caricatures of people. They are very plastic-like. They don't have any emotion. They don't look human, almost like people with masks on. And he's very unnerved by the whole thing, and gets them out of the house, and he goes that night or the next day to look at the photographs again. He has them in storage in his office, and they're gone, just gone. And so he contacts the magazine, and he says, hey, I think that the guys that you sent to interview me might have taken some of my property. Mm-hmm. And they're like, what guys? We didn't send anybody to interview you. He's like, no. And he talks about what happened, and these people said they were from the magazine, that they were going to do an article, and blah, blah, blah. And the editor says, you're not slated. We never slated an article about you. I have no idea what you're talking about. And that really rattled him. And at that point, he put everything away and decided it was not safe. And he heeded the man's advice and dropped it.
again, these thoughts that run through my head. So of course, at the end of World War II, Operation Paperclip, we brought the Nazi scientists here, and who knows what they would have done, but boy, these sound like Gestapo tactics.
They do.
From what you read, yeah.
And definitely these are heavy-handed. They're threats. They're not even veiled threats. They're threats. They're intimidation. And my last story I'd like to share tonight is actually, well, it may not sound like it's as dire as some of the others, but considering who it happened to, I think it's fascinating. So Dan Aykroyd, the actor,
Okay.
he's made no bones about it. He is unabashedly fascinated with everything in the paranormal realm. His father and grandfather were ghost hunters and were totally into the paranormal. So he's third generation. He grew up with this stuff, and he has an abiding fascination. In fact, even as though it's sort of hokey, the movie Ghostbusters, there are things in the movie that he placed in the movie because he's one of the writers of it, that actually are based on a real haunting that he experienced. And
tell me the library.
No, actually, it wasn't the library. There's the section where he's laying in bed and his pants come undone. And he actually rented or bought a house or something. I'm not sure if he rented or he bought it when he was a young man. And he would feel what he thought was a male get in bed with him at night. And he would jump up and, and roll over, and like there'd be nobody there. But this consistently continued to happen. And then he would feel this male sometimes touch his leg and stuff. It creeped him out really bad. Well, he found out that the man who had died in the house previous to him taking possession of it had been a gay man. And he said, I always just thought it was him. I knew it was him. And he was just enjoying the fact he was playing a game with me. And so that's actually, but he has had a lot of those experiences. And he's done a lot of TV shows, movies, and TV series. Sci Factor and different things like that. So he's getting ready to do a new movie or do a new series at the point this story begins. And he is, on the set. They've already contracted. They're shooting the first episodes, and everything seems to be going right along the way it ought to be. And he gets a phone call from a actress he knows. And actually, it was Britney Spears, to be honest.
Okay.
And she's going to be hosting Saturday Night Live. And she wants to know if he will come and do a skit with her. He came from that world, and she would enjoy doing this with him. And so she's talking to him on the phone, and he steps out of the studio to talk to her. He goes out. He's standing there along, on the street, basically talking to her, and goes back in and is confronted by the producer, who says to him, hey, Dan, we're going to have to pull the plug on this project. Now, while he was outside, he noticed, he's talking to Britney Spears, he notices a man in black comes up, gets out of a very old-fashioned looking car from the 50s or 60s, and it's a black car, and he gets out and he looks directly at Dan Aykroyd, and the man was tall, he was pale, the black suit. He gave Aykroyd this very dirty look, turned around, got back in the car, and drove away. And when he goes in, the producers just canceled the shoot. They canceled all of it. They were like, we're sorry. The show was going to be called Out There, and it was going to be like episodes about bizarre things that happen. And he was going to focus heavily on UFOs. And he thought that this was them letting him know that they didn't want him focusing on UFOs. Yeah, I just thought it was...
and what time frame was this?
This was about 15, 20 years ago. He was
Okay.
doing this. So, but it was just really interesting that he would talk about it on Coast to Coast and a couple different places about the fact that he believed that this was their way of shutting down a project where he wanted to illuminate some of these darker stories. And so we've come to the end of our time, and the questions as to who or what they are remain, as they probably always will. And I want to visit this subject again multiple times, looking at different perspectives, making different arguments. And I have to tell you, I'm not wed to any one concept, because I believe that multiple things are going on and they're playing out inadvertently or deliberately, depending on what they are. And so, to be a good writer, to be a good researcher, to function in this field at all, you can't have any skin in the game. You just have to let the facts take you where you got to go. So I don't have any skin in the game. They could be androids, they can be aliens, they can be demons, they can be whatever they are. And I'm not going to go down one path and preach that this is what they are. I'm just going to present the materials and allow people to make up their own mind. Anybody who's read my books knows that I don't tell you what to believe in the books. I just tell you, here are the stories, and you figure it out.
I can do that.
Yep, that's exactly. I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah.
Because I could be wrong.
Yeah, some people don't like that. Some people want the answers spelled out for them. I'm not one of those people. I don't mind being presented with the information and then formulating my own opinion or formulating what's happening. So it's just, to me, that's part of the fun. But I know that's not everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah,
I'm married to somebody like that.
To me, it's the fun too. But on the other hand, if you don't have an answer, and there is no clear answer, I can't give you a definitive answer, because there's not enough data to take me into just one direction. The data is all over the map. So I just give you the data and say, this is what I know so far. I'll let you know whenever something else comes in.
Well, and from the Men in Black, they may not actually be just one thing, as you mentioned before. There could be multiple actors,
Sure. And I think that it's that way with a lot of stuff. Like I spend a lot of time on like ghosts and that sort of thing. And it's not a singular answer. People go, do you believe in ghosts? Yes, I do. I also believe people fake things. I also believe people honestly and sincerely make mistakes. I also, I think there's people that have mental issues and emotional issues and psychological issues, and they're all different. And that all of these things are factors. And I have to account for all of those things every time I hear a story. And then when I'm researching it, I'm looking at a lot of different stuff. It's not as simple as, well, hey, we bought this house and we see a lady in white, and golly gee, that's a great haunting. So my question is, what happened to this property? And is there any history of a woman dying on this property? And, what information do I have that I can verify?
Yeah. I'm waiting for the story. You hear the stories about women in white, women in black. I'm waiting for the woman in plaid.
Not had a plaid one, but I've seen women in red. I mean, women in blue. I don't know. They don't seem to like patterns and checks and stuff.
Yeah. I just thrown a little humor in there.
Yeah. Don't have one of those yet. But if I get one, Stu, you're the first one I'm going to tell.
All right. No, I would be looking specifically for the Scottish tartan of my last name.
Definitely. I'll see what I can come up with. There's got to be something out there. But I hope you've had a good time. I hope everybody that's listening is having a good time. I just think it's a really fascinating field. And like I said, I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about different areas of it in time. I have some conspiracy episodes I want to talk about because some new stuff has come out. People just you have to think and keep looking and keep questioning all the time. My boys I used to do that with my kids all the time, make them question stuff and justify things. And my one son said to me one day as an adult, he said, I wish you wouldn't have done that. And I said, why? And he said, because now I have no excuses.
Yeah.
And I get it. I get what he's saying. He can't plead the fifth. He can't plead he doesn't know.
Mm-hmm.
And, and so he's like that. He's outside the box all the time questioning things. People are like, let it go, dude. And he's like, I can't.
Mm-hmm. So I think that is a wrap for this episode, don't you?
I do. I think we did it. I think hopefully you enjoyed it. It was interesting.
Oh, I enjoyed it immensely. So a little teaser for next time.
Well, next time, I have been definitely playing around with a couple different topics, but I'm thinking that we're going to do some ghost stories. I've kind of gotten to the place where I'm missing some of my ghostly stories. So maybe next episode we'll just sit down and tell some really cool ghost stories, unusual ones that have stood out to me. And then we'll go bouncing from there off to the black-eyed children.
Looking forward to those, both of those. All right, Patty.
Ghost stories and black-eyed kids next. Those two things.
All right. So, all right, though. Thank you again, and good night, Patty.
Good night.